All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trauma-Informed Church Kid podcast. Today and every day, we are reconstructing religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. And today, I have my good friend all the way from Australia, Phil Bray, here on for an expertise episode with us. So hi, Phil.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. It's kind of weird to see you not being at like 4 a.m. in the morning, because usually whenever we do live streams or something, that's about the only time we can make it work.
Yep. I was up early while it was still dark. I've done a big bike ride and now I'm back.
Yeah.
Maybe slightly out of breath, but I'm here.
Yeah, right. No kidding.
Yep.
Yeah, I have a mountain bike group that I go out with, and they're starting up next week because, of course, out here we have daylight savings time. And so, now we can actually get out after work without it winding up being a nighttime bike ride with lights and everything. So I'm looking forward to getting back in the saddle, literally.
After this, I should show you my bikes on the wall because I'm in the garage right now.
Yeah, I would like that very much. I love bikes. Well, that actually brings up a question that I always ask everybody when I sit down for an expertise with them is, I have my cup here, my best friend from college, his name is Josh. He has a decaf coffee business, and so I'm drinking some of his Papua New Guinea decaf coffee from Self-Same Coffee. So that's what I'm drinking today. That's how about you? What are you drinking?
Well, disappointingly, I did not have time to get tea ready. But
I know, usually you do.
Yeah, I know. It's disappointing. I've got a very boring Powerade Gatorade thing.
That works.
However, this morning at 6 a.m., I was drinking an Ethiopian filter coffee, batch brew, from my local cafe called White Horse.
Oh, that sounds nice. That does. Yeah, Ethiopian Yirgacheffe is one that I really enjoy for coffee.
Yep. It was good.
So I wanted to give you a little bit of a chance. I mean, obviously I know you pretty well, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a chance to introduce yourself to everybody else out there and share any details that you think is relevant, and go ahead and get going.
Yeah. So I'm Phil Bray. I live in Sydney, Australia, well, just south of Sydney, in a nice part of the world with lots of national park, lots of bush and roads for cycling. I wasn't in the bush this morning. I was on the road, but normally I'm in the bush. At the moment, I'm working for a coffee roasting company, but I'm fixing coffee machines. So I'm the head coffee machine technician. However, my first job out of school was a butcher, and I recently published a book called Leviticus on the Butcher's Block, where I used my butchering experience. So I'm a qualified butcher. I did my trade, did my apprenticeship, and wrote a book on Leviticus and sacrifice from a butcher's perspective. What else? I'm married to Kiralee, and I've got 3 kids between 7 and 14.
Got it. I can encourage everybody to go ahead and go to Amazon or Whitfenstock, which is the publisher directly, and just be able to search for Leviticus and Butcher. And I'm pretty sure that will be, that Phil's book will be the first one that pops up. But I also have a link in the show notes. But it's an excellent book. It's a very, I don't want to say light read because there's a lot of, substantive content there, but it's not a super academic, dense read like a lot of sacrificial books are. So I certainly recommend it to everybody. And I can confirm he does not butcher the book of Leviticus. And since I'm a dad, I am contractually obligated to make those kinds of jokes. So
yeah, I was very intentional to make it not academic. So it's not quite at explain it to me like I'm 5 level, but definitely a teenager could pick it up. That was my goal, actually, to make it, one was to make it beautiful, not just like a boring academic book. But the second one was that a teenager could pick it up and enjoy it. So
good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, right now I only have a Kindle copy, but I'm definitely going to go pick up a paperback copy, and then I'll just have that around the house and make sure I give my daughter a chance to take a look at that when she gets older. So that'll be fun. Well, we are getting into the book of Leviticus now in the podcast, and we are about to dive into taking a look at holy and common and clean and unclean. So I wanted to spend some time just looking at that specifically. And so I am kind of curious, even though your book doesn't specifically focus completely upon this, obviously that's the background for everything that the sacrificial system is designed for. So what does holy actually mean?
Yeah, good question. The definition that I've heard most often is set
Mm-hmm.
apart.
Mm-hmm.
And probably like most Bible words that you hear, there's some truth in it, but definitely not all of it. There's a lot more to holy than just set apart. So
Mm-hmm.
you can't imagine the angels standing around God saying, set apart, set apart, set apart, like how set apart you are.
Yeah, that's interesting because one of the things I discovered as I was doing some of the research for the podcast episodes is especially like Mary Douglas, who I know you are familiar with and you've used that as a resource for some of your work. She talks about it a lot in the context of like being whole, being complete, being all put together. So I'm curious, like what is the relationship of holy to something being unblemished, and what does that mean? Is that like a moral thing? Is it something else? Like how does that work?
Yeah, another great question. What I've found, there's actually a lot of Hebrew words contain the idea of wholeness or completeness.
Okay.
Yeah, like unblemished is one of them. Tamim
Mm-hmm.
is the word.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And basically it means whole or complete. So if you brought an animal for an offering to God, it had to be unblemished.
Okay.
Some Bible translations will say it cannot have a defect, without defect. And that's kind of the idea. However, when you use that language to talk about a human, which the Bible does, talks about a
Yeah.
priest.
Yeah.
And a priest must have no defect to draw near to God. And that can sound problematic. So
Yeah.
I found that it's better to explain it more in terms of whole and complete. And then if you think about the image of God and humanity,
Okay.
let's say God's desire is for humanity to be his images, then ultimately what that looks like is Jesus.
Yeah.
But I think the animals and the priests are like a shadow of that. So they're an image of Jesus, who is the most complete Son of Man, I guess.
Fully tamim.
Fully tamim. So they have no, Leviticus will say he can't have a limp. He can't be a hunchback. He can't be a dwarf.
Okay.
And all of that sounds like problematic, yeah? Like it sounds like you're
Yeah.
discriminating against a disability.
Right.
However, the way that I've come to understand it is that it's a representation of what humanity will look like when we are in God's presence. And maybe we want to talk later because I've read an amazing book on, I can't remember the title, but it explores the idea of will we bring our disability with us into new creation?
That is interesting because not only because it means that pirates can't be priests, which, by the way, that's a reference to Phil's YouTube channel, Leviticus is Fun, which I highly recommend to everybody. It is full of bone dry Australian humor, and I love it. It is wacky and delightful. So it's very, very fun and also educational at the same time. But anyway, so that discriminatory aspect, or at least what feels like that, raises an interesting question. Like, is it bad to not be holy, to not be whole or complete? Is there something wrong with a person when they're like that?
Yeah. And yeah, so that's really, really important because no, it's not morally wrong. It's definitely not sinful. It's often expected that for an Israelite, an ancient Hebrew, that you at times would be not so. Okay, at some point we're going to have to distinguish the difference between holy and common, clean and unclean, and then morally sinful or sin and clean or righteous. But being common or being unclean is not sinful.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, it's not a moral issue. So a priest who's a dwarf or has a limp or a broken leg hasn't done anything wrong. And in the same way, an animal that you might bring for a sacrifice that has a defect is not unblemished, and so is not appropriate to bring as a gift for God. That has a broken leg or a limp or something isn't morally wrong. They're not morally culpable. That's not their fault.
Yes.
But it's not an appropriate gift for God. And I think that represents what humanity and animals and basically what creation will be like when we enter into God's presence.
Okay.
Ultimately.
So why is that even necessary to distinguish between holy and common? Why is there this emphasis on trying to have a recreation, so to speak, come into the presence?
Yeah, I think it's an acknowledgement that outside of Eden, that creation, well, the New Testament says creation groans with longing. I think there's an innate knowledge. We can feel it in our bones that life at the moment is painful. Like we know that death is not right. There's something about death that is not right. There's something about pain and tears that we just hope for something better. We can kind of feel it, even if we can't explain it, that like our bodies long for something more complete. Like we're always longing for, bigger, better, something more complete. We look for it in the wrong places. I think that the Leviticus sacrificial system and the distinction between clean and unclean and holy and common is a way of acknowledging that life as we experience it now isn't yet complete.
Right.
And in contrast to Israel's neighbors, God was trying to show them that a lot of what they're doing is not okay. And I want you to be my holy people, and I'm going to show you a better way to live.
So there's the set apart aspect.
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So one last thing about holy before we move on to clean and unclean, pure and impure. You had said something that, I made sure I highlighted it I only have my Kindle, so, but I made sure I highlighted it, where you said, heaven has infected every part of creation, when you were talking about Jesus being holy and what that means. And that, of course, brings this concept of contagious holiness. So I'm kind of curious, like, what is that? What does that mean? Where can we find that? And why does that matter?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm asking really big questions.
Yeah. I think it's N.T. Wright who says something about heaven is everywhere, but it's a more real dimension that we experience, but we just can't see it. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's about heaven is the reality that is, we just can't see or experience it in our current state. And so before Jesus, the whole idea or God's desire to dwell among humanity, which was kind of made known through the tabernacle and God's presence in the middle of his people. I think that was him demonstrating his desire to live among humanity. You're right. This is a very big question. The tabernacle itself, it was like a little Eden.
Okay.
And so that was supposed to communicate to the Israelites that God was inviting them into that Eden-like relationship. And they would have understood that when they bring an offering and a sacrifice to God and place it on the altar, that as the smoke ascends upwards to where they imagined that God was up there, that action of bringing a gift and sending it up in smoke to God connected heaven and earth. So already they would have had in their mind that the tabernacle was like a little heaven on earth or a little Eden on earth, an Eden space in the middle of their camp. But the act of putting an offering on an altar and sending it up in smoke was a visual way to experience that connection. And then if they ate the meal, that was even a more of a way of experience that connection through a meal with their God.
Yeah. Of like quite literally taking in to themselves the life of heaven.
Yes.
Okay.
But,
So go ahead.
I was just going to link it to Jesus, that Jesus is God dwelling in the midst of humanity, literally. And so Jesus wasn't in like a tent or a tabernacle. He is God in the flesh, living amongst humanity. He
tabernacled among us. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
And so in that sense, all the things that the tabernacle was a shadow of, like pure, unblemished animals, unblemished priests, cleansed people and healed diseases, that kind of happened when people came into contact with Jesus. So that's like the infection of Jesus' holiness filling the earth.
Yeah. I think that's a really important one to get right, because I think a lot of times we envision that like holiness is somehow like threatened or endangered by impurity. And there is a sense in which impurity does pollute, yes, but I think one of the other things you said at one point in your book is that when holiness and impurity come into contact, holiness wins.
Yep. Yeah. In the Old Testament, holiness winning might look like being consumed by fire.
Yes.
If something impure comes into contact with holiness.
Yes.
However, when impurity comes into contact with Jesus, it often looks like healing or forgiveness.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. No, it's a big tree with deep roots and lots of branches. So I'll just spend a lot of the rest of the season unpacking that, and we'll move on to clean and unclean today. Because we have been talking about purity and impurity. Like, what does it mean to be clean? What does it mean to be pure? And is being impure or unclean a moral issue?
So things that made you unclean could be stepping on a dead lizard, then you're unclean. So maybe I'll just list a few things and hopefully it'll become pretty quickly obvious whether or not it's morally sinful. Stepping on a dead lizard, menstruating after sex, touching a dead animal. Even interestingly, if you had an animal that you'd set aside to bring as an offering to God and it died in the field and you've touched it, you're now unclean. Touching a dead human body, or even if you're a priest, being in close proximity, so being in the same room as a dead body, basically going to a funeral, you were unclean. So emphatically, no, being unclean is not sinful. In fact, God commands people to bury the dead and to be fruitful and multiply. So, have sex.
So actually following the commandments of God could result in ritual impurity or a certain kind of uncleanness.
Yep.
Okay.
So the high priest wasn't supposed to attend a funeral. Because he is like the ultimate whole tamim representative. However, other priests were allowed. So it says in Leviticus that they may attend a funeral for a relative, and that would make them unclean. And it says that in Leviticus, you may become unclean for a relative. And then they just had to wait. I think it's one of those where you wait till evening, you bathe, you wash, and then you're clean again. So it would have been a common state for most Israelites a lot of the time to be unclean. And normally it's not an issue. You just wait, you bathe, and then in the morning or at evening, you're clean again.
Okay.
Probably it would only be an issue if you wanted to come close to holy space, so to present an offering.
Which is why the priests had to be careful. Okay.
Yep. The closer you got to God's presence or the Eden space, the more you had to leave that impurity behind.
Why would that be necessary? What is it about impurity, especially like ordinary natural things like menstruation or childbirth or marital relations or or just simple everyday accidental things like coming into contact with a dead lizard? Why would any of those things prohibit somebody from going to the tabernacle?
Yeah, so there's a few theories. I think ultimately it's, like I said before, it's an image of what creation or the Eden relationship with God looks like. Okay. So Tim Mackey and Bible Project, his theory, which I think he largely gets from Milgram, is that anything death related made you unclean.
Yes, that is from Milgram.
Yeah. Yep. And that kind of makes sense a lot of the time, but it gets a bit icky when you start talking about marital relations and menstruation and like animals like reptiles that were unclean.
Okay.
Maybe they're related to the snake, but then, animals that don't chew the cud, like a rabbit, it's pretty hard to work out how that's kind of death related.
Yeah.
So it's not clean. I mean, when I say clean, it's not tidy to say that it's death related.
Okay.
Like it makes sense with eagles, like birds of prey are unclean, maybe because they're in contact with death and death.
Yeah. Like vultures
vultures, eagles. Yep.
Okay.
Death wouldn't be a good part of God's new creation. So you can kind of see why, as an image or a shadow of what the Eden relationship is like, anything that might bring the image of death into God's space, you should leave outside because that's not an appropriate thing to have in there.
So we're not 100% sure exactly what the rationale is behind what makes a thing unclean or clean and why this and not that. But the really salient point to really hammer home is if you're unclean, there's no one in the community going, ugh, what's wrong with you? And B, it certainly is not a guilt thing. It's not something that you did wrong. There's not anything wrong with you, whether just by virtue of being female or anything else. It's not a bad, evil, wicked, sinful thing.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we talked about Mary Douglas,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I prefer her definition or her theory, because it is a theory
Yeah.
at the end of the day.
Things
We
out
don't
of
really,
place.
yeah, things out of place. So
Yeah.
death is obviously out of place, so that fits. But then I think she envisages the idea of groups of things in their right place. So when God created the world, he separated light from dark. He separated day from night. He separated dry land from the waters. So everything has its place. And then anything that seems to have strayed outside of its place, like death, or blood on the outside.
Yeah.
Um,
Or creeping things.
Or, yep, things that have lost their legs.
Yes.
Or animals that have wings but can't fly. Or,
Okay.
animals that don't have wings but do fly. Or that, yeah. So you get the idea. Things that should be in the certain class of thing, but they're outside of that. So that thing
Got it.
isn't a good representation of what it looks like to be whole and complete in Eden. But it's an image. It's not. It's not moral. It's not to say that there won't be lizards in the new creation.
Okay.
But I think it's teaching something through an image, which I like. It took me a while to learn that from Leviticus, because I'm a very cognitive, left-brained person.
Okay.
But now I appreciate learning through images.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for kind of going into that piece of the puzzle, because that is, by the time this episode airs, we will have already covered a little bit of holy and common and clean and unclean. But I always think it's valuable, just for me as a person who grew up, frankly, not reading Leviticus and also being taught certain things about what was in Leviticus that wound up to be not true. It's almost a case where you cannot say it often enough. So, okay. Well, thank you very much for that. So what we will not have covered by the time this episode airs is sacrifices. And that is the core content of your book. So I would love to spend the remainder of our time taking a look at what sacrifices are and how they functioned and understand that a little bit better.
Yeah.
Again, big question.
Big question, yeah. And I'm in the middle of, or hopefully I need to finish it today, of writing a script for a video on Passover. And so I've been thinking a lot about the different kinds and different Hebrew words for sacrifice.
Yeah.
This one is on Passover as food, as a meal.
And that does seem to be pretty central to, if not all the sacrifices, at least the vast majority of them, is some sense of food. Like when I read through Leviticus, I keep hearing, it is the Lord's food offering. It is the Lord's table, pleasing aroma, those kinds of things. And then, of course, those cases such as, for example, the peace or fellowship offering and the purification offering or the sin offering, those are literally eaten in certain cases. So it does seem like food has a role to play in sacrifices. So could you unpack that a little bit?
I've just thought of this now. Can we play a little game? Can I?
Yeah, all right. I'm ready. Let's go.
I'll explain. So there's three off the top of my head. The three different Hebrew words for sacrifice. And if I explain them, can we guess which one Passover is?
Okay.
And it's only described as a sacrifice once in Exodus and then a few times in Deuteronomy and elsewhere.
Okay.
But,
all right.
Okay. So
I may have to recuse myself, but I will.
So the first one is Cain and Abel. So Cain brings fruit of the ground to God. And Abel brings the best bits of an animal, so the fatty portions. And don't ask me how he knew what was the best bits to eat of an animal. Were they eating animals then, or did he just know? Don't know. So that's the mincha, which is the same word for the grain offering, which basically just means present or gift. So that same word is used when people give gifts to each other. Doesn't have to be like a sacrifice offering given to God. It's just a gift that you would give to, your brother, whatever. So the other offering is basically bringing something near, korban.
Okay. Yes.
Which is, so the burnt offering is brought near, the sin offering is brought near. And if you were to literally translate it, it would be when anyone brings near their nearness gift. So it's the idea of presenting a gift to God, kind of putting it or bringing it in or close to his presence. And then you as the
Okay.
offerer are a kind of, the understanding is that you're also coming closer to God's presence as the
Okay.
bearer of that gift.
Okay.
So that's that one. And then the burnt offering, the olah, it goes up literally into God's presence in smoke.
Uh-huh.
And that's often described as a pleasing aroma. And then the other word is zebah or zebach. And this is the interesting one because almost every time you read about this one, it's within the context of a meal. So the peace offering is zebah, and that's the word that we'll see in our Bibles as sacrifice, as opposed to offering. So most of the other times, depending on your translation, but usually it'll be offering if it's just the bringing near korban offering.
Okay.
But
Okay.
zebah or zebach will be sacrifice.
Specifically an eaten sacrifice.
Yeah, so that's the fascinating bit. If you look up every time that word appears, basically within that verse, there'll be someone eating the sacrifice. So the first time is in Genesis when Jacob brings a sacrifice to make up with his father-in-law, Laban, after they've had a bit of a fight. And they're kind of making a covenant. And so how do they kind of make peace with each other and make a covenant? Bring a zebach. And they sit down to a meal, and that's understood that they're eating at the same table and that they're kind of united and that they're at peace, and they would protect each other, they'd have each other's backs, and that they wouldn't fight each other. So
got it. Okay.
Yep.
So
with that said, which one is Passover?
Sorry, go ahead. Okay,
So
which one is Passover? The one you eat, because that was really important with the Passover, is eating things.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't really a sacred space concept. They're at least fully fleshed out and systematized. So it's not the bringing near one. And there were elements of the mincha, but the whole portioning of the animal that Abel did wasn't part of the Pascha lamb. So
here's a question then. If it is a mincha, who was the gift given to? Because God doesn't get any of the Passover sacrifice. Yeah. So
almost like one could perhaps say it was God giving the gift to his people.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Which is wildly different than the other ancient Near East gods. It was purely a one-way street in the surrounding cultures.
Yeah. I actually think that the Passover is doing a few things. I think it's doing covenant. So the marking of the houses as God's covenant. So they're in the midst of enemy territory. Yeah? They're under the dominion of the Egyptian gods. The Passover, the last plague, the 10th plague was specifically judgment against Egypt's gods. So I think it was understood that they're in an oppressive enemy territory where they're under the oppression and the rule of Egypt's gods. So while they're in there, it's not really an appropriate spot to offer a sacrifice to God.
And Moses several times says, like, let's go out in the wilderness to give sacrifices because we can't do it here.
That's right.
Yeah.
Let us leave. Yeah. We'll offer sacrifices out in. So probably you could argue that Egypt was impure and unclean.
Yes.
And they needed to get out of that unclean space.
Yes.
And get to a space that was clean. And that would be a more appropriate space to present a gift to God. But while they're in enemy territory, they mark the houses with the blood of the lamb. Okay. That marks the house as clean. And I think at the same time, I'm doing some research in this at the moment, but I think it's a covenant, a sign of the covenant as well, like a prelude to when they actually do the blood of the lamb out at Mount Sinai.
Okay.
But the people are marked as belonging to God, not the angel of death or not Egyptian gods.
Yeah.
And then they're rescued. So they get to eat the meal, that nothing's given to God at that point. The lamb to eat is all for them. I think God's saying, here, you're in slavery, you eat the lamb. And then when I've rescued you out of enemy territory and you're sitting at my mountain, then you can bring gifts to me. And they still eat it, but then the people themselves then are marked with the blood of the covenant.
Got it. Okay. It makes me think a little bit of like in occupied France during World War II. The Nazi regime has overrun the whole country, And there's this Vichy government that is propped up by the Nazis, but then there's a whole underground movement, and they would probably have, their own little symbols or ways of being able to communicate to each other without words, saying, "Hey, we're all part of the same team here." And that's kind of what it seems like is happening with the blood, is marking them as we belong to the good guys, not the bad guys. And so when the invading armies, come in, then they can be able to, say, look, almost like Rahab and in the Scarlet Thread outside of Jericho, like they can be able to say, we're on your side, we're with you, rather than just the allies crushing all in their path.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I said in the video I just put out, that Israel wasn't the target. So a lot of people like to say they have to go to one verse to make it seem like Israel was guilty as well, and that everyone was the target this time. But if you actually carefully read it, Israel wasn't the target. Yeah.
Very much, yes.
Yeah.
And I did unpack that in not a lot of depth because I only have 30 minutes, but in some depth in the episode I did on the Passover about being marked by the blood. So if anyone wants to look into a little bit more of that, then I'll make sure I put a link to that in the video. But that does raise an interesting question. Like, the sacrificial system has been very frequently used to prop up ideas about, like, specifically penal substitutionary atonement. The idea being that a person sins, they bring an animal, and the animal dies in their place. And of course, the animal is then used to make atonement, theoretically. The animal dies in their place in the sense that, like, the animal is punished, is given the sentence of death that should have gone to the individual. So I'm just wondering, what is that? Is that the picture we see in Leviticus? Or if not, what picture do we see?
Yeah. So first of all, it can get really messy to suggest that a woman who has just given birth is guilty and deserves to be punished or deserves to die because she's unclean. So that at minimum should be an alarm.
Or a person who has a skin disease or a involuntary flow of body fluids.
Yep.
All of which require the sin offering.
Yep. And even if it's not offering something because you are unclean, just presenting a gift to God that you could do just because you fulfilled a vow, or you are, feeling especially grateful and you wanted to bring a gift close to God, or you wanted to celebrate with your family, all of those things. If you wanted to basically eat some lamb, have a roast lamb dinner, you would bring the lamb to the tabernacle and then take it back home to the family. So I think that's where you have to start. It's obviously food. And for some reason, we've forgotten that a lot of the time. But everything that is described is food. Like, you're not bringing lions or like gold or silver or precious stones or anything as a sacrifice. Like, everything is food. Even the grain offering is cakes baked in the oven or cooked with oil, or lamb, and then the fatty portions, which are the best bits, are placed on the altar and given to God.
And that's why dogs and donkeys can't be, or at least that's part of the reason why dogs and donkeys can't be sacrifices.
Yeah, they're the domestic animals that they would have already been keeping for food. Goats, lambs, cows, birds. So that, and another thing to say is that outside of Israel, outside of the Bible, their neighbors were doing sacrifice. And if you read ancient Hittite texts or Babylonian or Egyptian or Greek texts, just read Homer's Iliad. They offer lots of sacrifices, and it's always food. Even when they do like sneaky things and try and deceive the gods, or they want to get something and win the war from, to try and trick Zeus into helping them.
Yeah. If I remember, at one point they actually offer some cheese as.
I haven't read that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I believe it's in the cave of Polyphemus, if I remember right.
That would make sense. I mean, maybe, I don't know how much cheese they were eating to give. If I was a god, I would like to receive some nice runny brie or camembert or something. That would be my jam.
So that's interesting because, like, when you were talking about sacrifices being food, and you were talking about, everybody sitting down at the same table and consuming it together. Well, I guess that's really my question, is like, is the sacrifice creating the covenantal relationship, like making it happen, like it's broken, and then the sacrifice fixes that? Or is it something else happening?
No. So sacrifices explained in Leviticus are a response within the covenant. The covenant's already been made. They're already God's chosen people. They are just presenting an offering and a gift within that covenantal relationship, almost as an acknowledgement of, yes, we acknowledge that you are our God. You're the God who brought us out of Egypt and made us your special possession. And, we want to be your people, and we want to be close to you and acknowledge that you want to dwell in our midst. Yeah. It's not at all. So even in the other so Israel's neighbors, when they would give a gift to propitiate the God, so they weren't in a covenant relationship with their God. They needed to.
This was like slaves. Yeah.
Yeah. They needed to persuade the God to look favorably on them and to give them what they wanted. They would give a gift. It's still food. It's not that the God needed something to die so that he would listen to their request. They would be like, we want to win the war, so we're going to give you like this amazing bull, and we're going to arrange it with the glistening fat on the top, because we know that's the best bit that you want. And then here, look how great this offering is that we're giving you. Please let us defeat all our enemies. And that was the hope. But within Israel and the Hebrew Bible, God is still acknowledging that it's a food offering, but they're already within the covenantal relationship. So he doesn't need to be kind of butted up. He already looks favorably on them. So it's more an acknowledgement within that relationship. But that to say, it's just not there in Leviticus or in other ancient texts that it's something dying instead of the offerer.
Okay, so what then is the best way to understand the death? Because it is there. What is the relationship of death to the sacrifices?
Yeah, so the blood is important, and I'll get to that in a bit. At some point, it's just because if you're going to offer meat and food, the animal has to die. At another level, outside of the Bible, it was seen as like a noble way to give yourself to the God. So they actually, this is something I've just realized, they would try and keep the animal as calm as possible so that it seemed like the animal was giving itself up. Because if it resisted, then it was no longer an acceptable sacrifice. So the animal had to be on board. And so I think there's even stories of them like, I don't know if they used like drugs or incense or whatever. To make the animal really, really calm. Oh, no, sorry. In the Greek texts, they splashed water on the animal so that it would nod its head. Yep. And that's like...
And they're like,
okay.
oh, yeah.
Yeah,
it's agreeing to die.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I'd had to agree.
Yeah. Now, to be clear, this is not in the Bible. This is not just in the Bible. The surrounding ancient Near East culture.
Yeah.
So, okay.
But as a butcher, I know that a stressed animal isn't any good to eat. So actually people, butchers and farmers, will be very proud about how relaxed and calm their cattle are. They will try to have like the most relaxed and calm cattle that you can have because it's better quality meat. So you wouldn't want to give a stressed out animal on the altar. It just wouldn't be good eating.
Okay.
The same way, if you're going to torture it or beat it or bruise it, it's not good eating. It doesn't taste good. It doesn't look appetizing. So that there's no way that is an acceptable offering.
Got it.
So that isn't at all what defines a sacrifice.
Okay. All right. I'm going to stick a pin in that and come back around to that when we start talking about Jesus as a sacrifice. But for now, then, I'm just wondering, because I know that when I've had these conversations with people, they will sometimes see a minimizing of the death as being like some kind of, trying to get around the obvious detail and just say like, look, like there has to be death. Death has to happen. And death does happen. So what are we even talking about anymore? So I guess I'm just curious, like, is there such a thing as a living sacrifice? I know Paul talks about that in Romans 12, but is that something that was brand new that they just made up because of Jesus, or is that something that was always there?
Yeah, so the Levites are actually described using almost identical language to the animals that are brought as an offering. So I think it's in Numbers where you'll read about the Levites who are going to become priests, and you read the list of what of how tamim they had to be.
Yeah.
So without defect and all of the things that they had to be.
Okay.
And then the language is they're brought forward. I think it's that korban language of coming close.
Yes.
And they enter into God's presence. So that's the priests.
Yes.
And then you read about the animals, and it's almost identical, like almost word for word. So they can't be bruised, they can't be blemished, and then they're brought close, korban,
brought forward,
and they also enter into God's presence. However, they're not alive anymore, but they've become food and they're placed on the altar.
Okay. So it's almost like the death is maybe irrelevant is the wrong word here, but it's purely functional. It's not it's not something that carries the theological weight, at least certainly the weight that we've sometimes assigned to it.
Yeah, something that I discovered as I was writing my book is that after the animal has been slaughtered, and incidentally, there's no instructions on how to slaughter it. So if the death was important, then surely they would spend a bit of time and space explaining, you use a knife, you cut it left to right, you've got to be facing this certain direction, you've got to recite these words, but none of that. We don't even know if it was a knife. We kind of do know, but it's not in the Bible.
Right.
But
whereas
what
they
I
spend
discovered,
a lot of time on the other details.
Right.
Yes.
On the blood and the food and who can eat, who can't eat, and which bits to eat. Yep.
Yeah.
What I discovered is that after the slaughter, it's not described as a corpse or a carcass. So if the imagery that they wanted to communicate was that it was a death, then you would think that they would use words like corpse or carcass, because they're words that exist in Hebrew, and they're words that are used to talk about the Israelites.
God's wrath all the time.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
God is like
places like Isaiah 63, where it's just like, the carcasses or the corpses will be, laying out there. Like it is that word.
Yeah. And he says to the Israelites, if you disobey me in the wilderness, then your corpses will lie in the wilderness. So if the animal was supposed to be communicating to them that, look, this is what you deserved, or this is what will happen to you if you don't offer the sacrifice, you would think that they would talk more about a corpse or a carcass. However, the language, I think, intentionally shifts to an offering. And so what is actually placed on the altar isn't a corpse or a carcass. At that point, it's pieces of meat or just the offering. And that becomes a pleasing aroma.
Yes. Okay. And it's not the death or a dead thing that is presented to God.
Correct.
Nor is the death or the dead thing the thing that makes the aroma pleasing.
Yep. And actually in other texts, that's kind of a sneaky way that they get around that. It's kind of like a paradox here. So it is dead, but what you're presenting isn't death. You're presenting pieces of meat. So it's a way to conceptualize, no, I'm giving you something good here. The animal willingly gave itself over in some sense. But this is an acceptable gift because it's now going to become a pleasing aroma.
Got it. Okay. So moving away from aroma, speaking of that, obviously there's a lot of blood that is really, really central to some of the sacrifices, not all of them. And I'm just wondering, how would you characterize the role that blood plays within the sacrificial system?
So this one is different to Israel's neighbors. They may have had ideas of drinking blood, or of taking the blood of a powerful animal, like a lion or something, to kind of gain its strength. But the Bible, I think, counter to that is quite specific that no, all life belongs to God. I am the God.
So the Israelites are not allowed to take the life of a human, the life of an animal, the life of anything, and then either consume it or use it inappropriately, because it all belongs to Adonai. Okay.
Yep. So I think that compared to other cultures, it was different and specific. And God is saying, no, I am the God of life. Life comes from me. If you want life, you come to me. You don't take it for yourself. Yep. So like you said, you don't take human life. You don't even take animal life. If in Leviticus it talks about, if you're going to take the life of an animal, you'll give it to me. You'll present it to me at the tabernacle.
Yeah.
So in Leviticus 17, it talks
Yeah.
about the blood being the life. Like very, very specifically, 4 times, the blood
Yeah.
is the life. It starts
Yeah.
by saying the blood represents the life, and then it just says, no, the blood is
No.
the life.
Okay, so that's the image we should be having in our heads whenever we, like, going back to Passover, like you said, when the Passover blood is being painted with a hyssop branch, which the only other time the hyssop and blood come together is in the case of cutting the covenant and starting the covenant in Exodus 24. So again, there's that covenantal dynamic you talked about. But anyway, point being, when the angel of death passes by and sees the blood, the angel of death is thinking, this house is marked with life. I'm not allowed to enter because I am the angel of death, and this is a life house. Not the early 2000s band, but a... Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Yeah. Blood is life. And Passover, I think, yes, in part, the blood was representing that this household belongs to the God of life, not to death.
Got it.
But the blood was used to purify things in holy space, or to purify. So not as often as we might think. It wasn't used to purify people that much, but definitely every sacrifice, the blood was used to purify the altar before the offering and the pieces of meat were placed onto the altar. So it's like life is coming into a space that may have been affected by impurity or death or something that might be outside its proper domain, and then life is coming in, and it's like light and dark. Like darkness can't exist when the light is turned on. And I think it's the same image, that when life comes into contact with something that might have been affected by death or impurity, it just can't exist. Life, that's like I said before, life wins.
Got it. Okay.
So it's like taking back the space that may have been taken over by death or impurity. Life is reclaiming that space.
Got it. So now I'm going to pull out that little pin that I stuck in there about Jesus's death and the blood of Jesus, because I keep hearing things like we are covered in the blood, or the sins are covered by the blood, or washed in the blood of the Lamb, or those kinds of things. Is Jesus's blood seen as functioning in the same way?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Although those phrases I don't think actually appear in the Bible. Being washed in the blood isn't really a biblical image. Being washed in water definitely is.
Yeah.
Being purified by blood definitely is. But washing yourself in blood, not so much. Being sprinkled by the blood.
Revelation.
Yes. Maybe one time in Revelation, they wash their garments.
The robes are washed in the blood of the Lamb, I think.
Yes.
But yes, like that is a very ubiquitous phrase in common evangelicalism, and not at all, except for maybe one exception present. Okay.
Yep. So yes, Jesus' blood is all of those things. It is purifying. It is life-giving. It is covenantal blood. So it's the blood of the new covenant. So all of those things, yes. And then when you think about Holy Communion and drinking blood, which you weren't supposed to do, but it's okay now because God, the God of life, is sharing his life with us, which is pretty amazing.
So here we have a genuine, willing sacrifice. Like not this kind of fake out of like, okay, we're going to sprinkle it on your head and make you kind of do this. And okay, you agree. But no, like a genuine, like he tells his disciples, I lay down my life of my own accord. No one takes it from me. And I pick it back up again after I've laid it down. So because it is a willing sacrifice of life, or gift, I should say that it's a willing gift to humanity, to the whole cosmos of life. That is what makes it okay to take in and become a part of our life.
Yeah. And so in some church traditions, they will be really careful. So to say what you've just said, that Jesus wasn't killed so much as he willingly gave up his life. So what you said is important. The words, and Jesus says, into your hands, I commit my spirit. So he willingly gave up his life. Which is Ephesians as well. He offered himself,
as a pleasing
sacrifice.
aroma.
Yeah. But they're also careful, some church traditions, to say that we don't take communion, that we receive it. So we can't take. I'm not sure about Roman Catholic, but definitely in the Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
I think Catholic is the same, but you don't take communion. It's given to you. It's given for you and to you. and so you receive the bread and the wine, which
Okay.
I think that's beautiful.
Yes, it is. And actually, like right now, we're recording this in early March, which in about 1 month is going to come up on Easter. And not just on Good Friday, but pretty much anytime communion is taken, there's a lot of talk about like, think of how much Jesus suffered for you. Think of what he went through for you. This is the price he paid to be able to make you right with God and those kind of things. So I'm trying to understand, out of everything you've talked about with the way the sacrifices worked, like that was not a thing. It was not like sacrifices were not brutalized. They were not, tortured. And so that doesn't seem to match with that. But what should we be thinking about as we receive of communion? What kind of things would it make sense for us to be thinking about?
Yeah, so you're right that what happened to Jesus was brutal and torturous and violent and not okay. And none of those things are ideas or words that the Bible ever uses to describe a sacrifice. So, and interestingly, the New Testament doesn't ever speak about that aspect of Jesus' crucifixion as a sacrifice. I think the Bible, the New Testament especially, is very, very careful that when they do talk about Jesus as a sacrifice, it's either himself offering himself or that walk in love, just as Jesus loved you and offered himself willingly as a sacrifice.
The point being is that just like in the Levitical system, it was not the case that you had a sacrifice once you cut the animal's throat. Just like with Jesus, we don't have a sacrifice once he dies. There's a sacrifice, and the sacrificial act is the presentation of the parts, transfiguring them into a more etherealized existence, sending them up in smoke, up to the mountain of God, bringing the life of the animal, the blood, into the holy space and using that as a kind of ritual detergent to cleanse things. Like that was the sacrificial moment, is when that happened, not when an animal died, or for that matter, when Jesus died.
Yep.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, yes, I'm just trying to be careful because I don't want people to hear us saying that Jesus' death wasn't a sacrifice.
Yes.
Because, yes, the whole thing was a sacrifice, but it wasn't that it was painful and brutal that made it a sacrifice. It was that Jesus
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. Jesus willingly went to the cross, willingly gave up his own spirit, and God vindicated him and raised him from the dead.
Okay. All right. So now we have a little bit better understanding of what Old Testament sacrifices were and what Jesus' sacrifice was, as well as a little bit better understanding of holy and common, clean and unclean. So we've covered quite a bit of ground today. And thank you incredibly much for your time. But I want to be able to have people take away like a distilled sense of what we talked about. Like what would you say is the biggest points, the biggest emphases that you want to really hammer home so people can, if they skip to the end, then they can be able just to hear this and go, okay, now I get it.
Yeah. So I think I like to start with God's desire was to dwell in the midst of humanity. I think if you start there, and that's also why it's important to keep the Old Testament in your understanding of Jesus. Don't just cut that out.
Yeah.
God's desire was to dwell in the midst of his people, and all of the difficult bits. So the clean and unclean, the talk about, menstruating and not touching unclean animals and death and all that stuff that sounds discriminatory, that contributes to the image of what life will look like in God's space when God and humanity are dwelling together in an Eden-like relationship. Leviticus is the book that I think that shows us an image or a shadow of what it will look like one day when we have ascended the mountain of the Lord, or when we are living on God's mountain with him, that we will be whole and complete, that there will be no more sin, there will be no more tears, there will be no more death, there will be no more disability that inhibits us. Maybe we'll take some of the stuff that defines who we are, but hopefully what we take as defining who we are will be the character of Christ. But yeah, when we are with God in his space, we will be whole and complete, just as God intended us always to be. And I think Leviticus is a beautiful image of that. And Jesus humanizes that and makes and he's the link between heaven and earth, literally. And as we
Literally. Yes.
as we participate in him and are part of his body, and as we participate in Holy Communion, that's kind of reinforcing that truth.
I think that's so wonderful. I'm actually going to, just to tag on to what you said, I'm going to read a section from your book that really just grabbed me by the gut and hit me hard, because it relates to exactly what you were talking about there. And I just think it's really important that everybody can understand, first of all, exactly how great of a book this is. And second of all, to really get exactly what you just said, that this whole sacrificial system is not about solving a problem that God has to have something to be able to solve. It's about God saying, I want to be near you. And that's why this all happens. So this is from Phil's book, Leviticus on the Butcher's Block. The priests and the animals are like models on a catwalk, demonstrating not who we must be, but who we will be. The unblemished priests parade as God's representatives. The animals without defect present an image of the sound, entire, and perfect mind that we will possess when we too are drawn into God's presence. God is showing us the clothes we will be given, the healed and whole state of our liver and our kidneys, no deception in our passions, no wound in our emotions. We will be free from defect. We will be made whole and complete. No more cancer, no more broken bones, no blindness, no debilitating disease. Perhaps your blemish isn't physical. Perhaps it's your mind, your mental health. It's very apropos for the job I do and for what we try to do on the podcast. Maybe your morals are compromised. Perhaps you were the child that had an absent or abusive parent and grew up unable to experience complete safety, never knowing full love. There may be parts of your personality that aren't fully developed. You may even have developed your own moral blindness. Or perhaps you are the mother who was too unwell to care for her newborn baby, and you feel like you have a gaping hole in your own life and worry you have left a gaping hole in your child's life. My dearest reader, rest assured, God's desire is to dwell with you in the midst of that guilt and pain. And as he sits with you, he is saying, I want to make you whole again. And deep within, you know this to be true because you can imagine the daily spectacle of seeing perfect, complete animals enter into God's holy space. And every one of them is accepted by God. You know that God is showing you what life is like in his presence. No guilt, no depression, no anxiety, no failures, no faults. So that section just really hit me, and I definitely wanted to make sure I shared it with everybody as a reinforcement of why you should go out and buy Phil's book, but also exactly what this whole thing is all about.
Yeah, it's important. I mean, we had our own challenges. So my wife is a mental health nurse, and she works with mums of newborns, and a lot of them have trauma that was in their bodies that they didn't even know that they had until they give birth. And then that activates, something that they'd forgotten about. But I've just found that and I didn't expect this at all, like from Leviticus, but the image of complete animals or complete priests entering into God's presence, like whatever hole that we have in our life or whatever hole that we've imagined that we've done to our children or our friends or whatever, like we will be complete in God's presence. We will be just as he wants us and intends us to be.
That's wonderful. Okay. Thank you so much, Phil. I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate you spending all the effort you did on writing this book. And so everybody, I will have a link in the show notes for the Amazon page for Phil's book. And then also I'll have a link to Phil's YouTube channel, Leviticus is Fun. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And thank you very much, Phil.
Thank you. This was great.
On YouTube and X, you can find me at Church Kid Pod. And on Facebook, you can join the discussion in our discussion group, Trauma Informed Church Kids. If you find this content either enjoyable or important, please hit the like button and or subscribe on whatever platform you listen to. Of course, ratings, reviews, and sharing with others is the best way to increase visibility and ensure that more people hear or see this content. If you have questions or want to engage in dialogue, leave a comment on that platform. Alternatively, you can leave a voice message on SpeakPipe, and I will add it to the Q&R episodes at the end of the season. Finally, just one last word to everyone. I don't know your story, but I know the one who is walking with you in your story. I know that he loves you. He made you for a purpose, and that his plan for you is always better. If you have been hurt by the church, I am sorry for the ways in which we have borne the name in vain. That is our responsibility to repair and repent. I hope that this podcast starts you on your own journey to find resurrection on the other side of deconstruction. My prayer for you is the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.